my role as CEO of Goldred Research Labs, I get the opportunity to play with many different research laboratories that essentially we tend to partner with large, complex organizations that are already considered to be the best in their industry, and they are finding or looking for ways to get to the next step of improvement. This morning I want to share with you a case study and the background to the case study of a very interesting book publishing case study related to how to reduce shortages and surpluses within book publishing. I thought it might be appropriate to start with a quote from Goldratt from the introduction of the goal, where he said, finally and most importantly, I wanted to show with this book that we can all be outstanding scientists. The secret of being a good scientist, I believe, lies not in our brain power. We have enough, we simply need to look at reality, think logically and precisely about what we see. The key ingredient is to have the courage to face inconsistencies between what we see and deduce and the way things are done, and that this identification of inconsistencies and challenging of basic assumptions is essential to any breakthrough. So this is the spirit in which we do research projects, and what we have found out is regardless of the type of research project that we get involved in, there are always a few common basic assumptions that needs to be challenged, especially in cases where the company is already considered to be one of the best in the world. So the first assumption to challenge is, how do you go from impossible to improve? We are already doing the best that we can, to not only possible, but highly, highly realistic to improve. Once you've convinced somebody that it's impossible to improve, that there's a significant gap currently between the potential performance and the actual performance, the next challenge you will face is, we are different, we are complex. This will never work for us. So how do you go then from acknowledging that complexity, but then still showing that at the heart of it, there's a very simple solution for it? Even simple solutions can be very difficult to implement. So how do you go from difficult to easier, especially if we have the technology to do that? And then, of course, lastly, going from resistance to these changes that we are proposing to active contribution. And of course, there are very good reasons for the resistance. The research shows that across all the changes that are made in organizations, from the introduction of new products, to changing of incentive schemes, to introduction of new technology, there's a very good failure rate of about 70%. So you can imagine if you've been around an organization for some time, the chances that you are right by saying it will never work is quite good, 70% of the time. And that's really why we find that people resist change. Why? How do we move them to active contribution? I want to share with you the process that we are following. So the presentation outline is just to share with you the generic problem or the generic inconsistency in this type of industry, specifically related to the extent and consequences that this problem exists. And then what are the major causes and the direction of solution? I want to present it through a case study in book publishing. This project involved the largest trade publisher in the world. They do about 500 million odd books a year. And some of the leading retailers in the book industry, both physical book chains as well as online retailers, to show what is possible if you apply some common sense to a really big problem currently that is affecting each of the stakeholders very negatively. I want to take you through the phases, show you what we've found in each of the phases, and there will also be a follow-up paper that we are publishing related to this. Some of the research findings and then some of the future research. Humberto gave a presentation this morning. We have found very similar things, but also a little bit different because it's a different environment in terms of where further research is required, where current body of knowledge doesn't yet provide good enough answers. So let's start with a quick question. How many of you frequently do not find what you are looking for in the shop? Can you show hands? So it's quite interesting. The research shows something that if you have a shopping list of 40 items going into a supermarket, the chances that you'll find all 40 is 5%. And of course, there are consequences of not finding what you're looking for. What are the consumer response when you don't find exactly what you're looking for? Well, there's at least 5 different consumer responses that have been isolated, that during the research, you are trying to see which consumer response or which consumer responses are likely to be triggered by an out-of-stock situation, for example. So, do you come back later to the same retailer to buy the same product? Because in that case, neither the retailer nor the supplier has really lost, apart from the value of money for the time period that it took you to go back. Of course, you've irritated the consumer or customer, but this is important to acknowledge. Because in this case, if you've dramatically reduced out of stocks, do you expect to get much more sales? No. And this happens frequently when there are no real alternatives available. So if you go into a small town with one retailer, and there's really just one of these type of products being kept by a retailer, don't be surprised that you don't see a jump in sales by dramatically improving out of stocks. So this is something to be aware of. Secondly, you buy a similar product from the same retailer and the same supplier. So maybe you don't buy the 500 milliliter shampoo, but you are forced to buy either the smaller one or the bigger one because they had stock of it. Again, the same thing is true. Do you really expect to see a big jump in sales for either the retailer or for the supplier? No. You might see a small difference in the price. It might be even beneficial in that you encourage them to buy a more expensive item. Thirdly, buy a similar product from the same retailer but a different supplier. So rather than buy the one, you buy a competitor's product. Of course, there the retailer doesn't necessarily lose unless there's a big price difference, but the supplier definitely loses. Go to another retailer to buy the same product. In this case, the supplier doesn't necessarily lose, but the retailer does. And then lastly, do not buy anything. And the question is, how does each of these responses affect the various key stakeholders in that supply chain? There's, of course, the consumer, and Humberto highlighted to what level frustration happens when I go to a shop and I don't find everything that I'm looking for, and I either feel pressure to go somewhere else or to buy something that wasn't my first choice. Of course, there's a shop itself. In many cases, the shop is not just losing the sale, but they might be losing the customer. And when this experience happens frequently, you might decide never to go back to the shop, and you've lost the customer forever, which, by the way, is hidden in the lost sales opportunities, because simply the customer doesn't come into the shop anymore. Of course, there's the supplier and also the bank. Many of these shops we've seen, especially during the recession, many of these shops were not viable and had gone bankrupt, and dramatic losses were suffered by the banks that were funding them. So what's the real consequences of the shortage is an important question to answer and to have an expectation before you start with a pilot, before you start with a test or an experiment. And you need to have some knowledge of the industry, the type of product, and how consumers respond to it. Of course, when you look financially, what is the consequences? In this case, if you have either a retailer or a supplier that is selling about $1 billion a year, 1% lost sales in terms of volume is a 10% loss in net profit for either the book publisher or the supplier, or in this case, the retailer. So there's this 1 to 10 leverage that is frequently completely underestimated. And I'll share with you some examples of to what extent this impacts even the strategy of the business and where resources are being deployed. So just remember this, if that is the ratios, if the variable cost is about 50% of the selling price, which in book publishing it's about that, it's a combination of your printing and distribution cost and the royalties to authors. Then 1% lost sales in volume is equal to a 10% lost profitability. And of course, what ends up happening is you end up now with lower sales, so the percentage, your inventory makeup of your sales is higher, so your order or your return on investment is even worsely affected. So 1 to 10 leverage, there's a belief in the industry, common, not just in book publishing, that shortages and the related lost sales are not significantly. You frequently hear them quoting numbers of 2 to 3%, but even if those were true, we are talking about 20 to 30% lost profitability for both the retailer and for the supplier or manufacturer. And remember the principle that Goldrat highlighted many years ago: unless the consumer have really bought, nobody in the supply chain have really sold. The fact that I could get the wholesaler to take more product, if the consumer doesn't buy, nobody's really sold. There's, of course, a fear of, is it really worth it to invest in further reducing it, especially considering that it's so small, or that the assumption is that it is so small. And frequently here you hear about the mindset of there's diminishing returns. We've done the best that we can so far. Availability is quite good right throughout the supply chain. Yes, there is some problems from time to time at the consumer, but you can't predict the demand, so what do you want me to do? We're doing the best that we can. Pumping more money in it, we don't think that we'll get any form of significant return. And of course, there's a check. How do we really know that it is only 2 to 3%? And does it really match the experience we have as consumers? And this was a check that I asked this group of people to say, you've quoted me a number, but now think of yourself walking into a bookshop. What is your experience? What percentage of time do you actually find a book that you're looking for? If, by the way, you walked in with an expectation to find a specific book. And we know in book publishing about 50% of the purchases are impulse purchases. You walk in, you see what's available. They don't have this offer. You find another book in the same category and you buy. But when you did have an expectation and you walked in, is it really 97, 98% of the time? No, not even close. So where does this number come from? Well, there was some really good research done by the Grocery Manufacturers Association in combination with a few professors that I've been able to have some very interesting discussions, Dr. Thomas Gruen, related to this issue of out of stocks. And basically what they presented was that the industry research that have been repeated about every 10 years, typically covering over 600 retail outlets, 32 product categories, 71,000 consumers interviewed, 29 different countries, are showing that you've got an out-of-stock situation of around 8% across the world. And of course, the causes of that 8% is typically broken up into upstream causes where there are shortages of supply, in the store when they are not merchandising properly, so they have the stock in the back room, or it is somewhere in the room but the consumer doesn't find it, which is, by the way, one of the things that make it quite tricky to measure lost sales. Because when the consumer leaves, you don't know that they leave because they didn't find what they're looking for, but it was in the shop somewhere, just not where they expected, or whether there was really an out-of-stock situation. And then lastly, the ordering and forecasting patterns. So typically in combination, if you think about from a retail perspective, almost 60, 70% of the causes is actually under their control. Of course, what's the consumer responses? And that's a kind of a breakdown of those 5 consumer responses that I indicated. An important one there, about 10% of the time, the consumer leaves without ever buying. And again, you have to check it against your own experience and whether that's really true. You walk into a shop, you don't find what you're looking for, and you never buy. It's not that you will buy something else or go somewhere else to buy. And that's really the big potential, because remember here, the 1 to 10 leverage. For both sides, this is where both the retailer and the supplier is losing. So just halving that has a 50% impact on net profit for both of these parties. So very good data to do analysis on, and essentially what it shows is when you're combining these categories, you find that of the 8%, 8 to 9% lost sales, the retailer is essentially losing 3 to 4% sales because of the consumer response. And the supplier, on the other hand, is also losing about 3 to 3 to 4%. So about 50% of the out of stock results in a real lost sale for either the retailer or the manufacturer. But of course, there are problems with these numbers. They've tried to do the best job that they can, but as I mentioned, it doesn't necessarily measure accurately when there's really a lost sale. For example, when you look at the data, you might find that, yes, this supplier and retailer is already on a replenishment based on actual consumption basis. So they sell one, by the end of the week, they replenish one. They sell one, by the end of the week, they replenish one. And the question is, so what can you do better? And one thing that you can do better is to start looking in more detail, when did the consumption or the sale take place versus how long did it take them to replenish it. They sell it on a Monday, and they replace it again the next Friday or Saturday. That whole week, you've lost potential sales. So these are some of the statistics that we started with in terms of looking at, conservatively speaking, looking at research, what the real potential is for solving this problem for both sides. So what about surpluses? Of course, the same thing. How many of you have gone into a shop and bought something you didn't really want or need, simply because the shop offered you a big discount? Some of you might say that's the only way that you buy. Is there any other way? Why do people buy like this? Because we want to feel like we're getting a special deal. But it changes what we buy and when we buy. And frequently, of course, the problem here is that you typically are offering discounts on those items that are not moving. And if there is an alternative available of a new item that have just been introduced, by encouraging the person to buy the old item, you're not losing just the margin on that, but you're now losing the sale on the new item. These are the type of thing that the typical statistics that are gathered do not take into consideration. How frequently does it happen to you? Of course, I know a few people that say this happens all the time, because we are encouraged to buy when discounts are offered. And you might find if you go to the big cities like New York, there are closing down sales of a shop for the last 10 years. They're always closing down.
Yes.
Why? Because that's the way that they get you to buy. What's the real consequences of surpluses on each of these stakeholders? So for the consumer, you end up buying things that you don't really need or want. For the shop, you do get a sale if you do discount it. Of course, if you can't sell it, the surplus is a problem. In many industries, the shop carries that risk. So if they order too much, essentially they have to write it off, which almost guarantees that they will be conservative in their ordering. Does that make sense? So as a leverage opportunity, if you understand who is paying for the consequences, normally you can predict how they are behaving. So if they have to do the write-off, believe me, if they think they can sell 5, they'll order 3, just in case they don't sell the 5. Of course, on the supplier, big problem. Not just because they got somebody to buy something that they thought was needed and typically had to incur all the cost to manufacture it, especially when it's in big batches, but now there's the consequences of coming it back. Book publishing typically falls into the category of retail where there's a policy of no sale return. You can't sell it, you can return it at any time. And in some cases, the policy extends because the retailer has to pay the shipping cost, only return the front cover of the book. And I'll give you a full credit for the purchase. So this is kind of a big problem. And of course, for the banks, the more the surpluses is, the more they are putting money in that is not actually generating money, that is stuck in the system. So what is the net impact of surpluses? Offering a 1% discount on average on a company with $1 billion in sales reduces net profit by $10 million or 20%. So you have this leverage of 1 to 20. And it's quite interesting to share this with the salespeople and see their eyes open up because they give discounts so easily. In fact, a useful curve to draw is to draw distribution of the percentage of sales that happen at the full list price versus the percentage of sales that happen at the maximum discount and where the mean is. And it's always very close to the maximum discount. And I want to encourage you to do a test. You go into a shop and you say, if they are authorized to give discounts, what tends to happen is you ask for a discount and I'll give you the maximum they are authorized immediately without any question. Say, can you give me some discount on this? Yes, sure. I'll give you 15%. I have no idea what it's just done to the profitability. Of course, a good salesperson would first check the perception of value. So they will first start off by saying, actually, I'm not authorized to give any discounts. I'm sorry. And then depending on your reaction, they will start maybe with 2 or 3 or 5%, and then work their way down. And really, if you're on the verge of leaving the shop, then they might offer you the maximum. So these are small leverage things that we've identified, not just true in retail, but across all industries. The leverage is much, much bigger than expected. There's, of course, a belief that consumers are very sensitive to pricing, and discounts is necessary since lower prices equal more sales. So this is one question I asked for the book publishing. I said, look, I'm taking myself as a case. If I've bought a book for $20, if it's a bad book, the $20 was a waste of money. If it was a good book, the $20 is insignificant. So would I have really changed my buying behavior if the book was $25? No. It's more determined by the perception of value for the content. But there's, of course, references. So if it's way outside what I normally expect to pay for a book, I'll be very careful to look at it. We've been very interested to see how this handbook is selling at $99. Very high price for a book, and yet it seems to be selling because the perception of value is really high. People are saying, what's the worst that can happen? I get about $100 worth of value from this book. So this is something that's very interesting, and also to see how pricing is done within this book publishing industry. In many cases, it seemed, at least from an outsider perspective, to be quite arbitrary. To say, this type of book we normally launch at a pricing point of $14.99. You say, well, have you ever tried, $15.99? No. Okay, that's quite a big difference in profitability. Maybe we should do an experiment. Why do you guys print prices on the books? It doesn't make sense because it means you can't experiment with price sensitivity. Once you've released a book, that's it. You have to sell it at that price. But if you suddenly find that there's an extreme demand that's become accidentally, frequently, a bestseller, you have the opportunity to play around with pricing, but if it's printed on a book, you can't. So we started exploring this a little bit and asking the question, the fear is that by reducing the discount or by increasing the price, it will really reduce sales. And said, this should be something that we should test. And when I shared it to the CEO of the company, he went like this. He said, oh my God. He said, many years ago, he asked them to look at this issue of pricing at $9.95 versus $9.99. Now, with such a small difference, it really doesn't impact you. I mean, I don't know who has gone, oh, this one is $9.95, I'm going to buy it. That one is $9.99, I'm not going to buy it. But it's kind of 2%, which means 2 times 20 is 40% of the net profit of that book is determined by this very arbitrary decision to make it $9.95 or $9.99. So we started encouraging to look at these opportunities. They initially approached us purely from a surpluses point of view, which is a little bit more details that I'll share. So is it not possible to significantly reduce the surpluses that frequently is the main cause of discounts? So we started and said, look, book publishing is just a type of supply chain. So with this type of consumer goods supply chains, where's the real constraint? And Goldratt reminded us again, isn't it obvious that the real constraint is the number of customers willing to buy? Exploiting the constraint, therefore, means the customer has arrived in the retailer, make sure that they do buy. Elevating the constraint means getting more customers to arrive in the shop. What limits customers to buy more? So what are the conditions for better exploiting? Of course, it's shortages on the one side, and on the other side, it's space or cash constraints that block me from offering a wider variety. Now, this by itself is quite an interesting research topic, because there's very good research that have been published that shows a promotion done with international coffees, 20 coffees, with the really beautiful girls walking around offering samples of this international coffee, and it's compared against a control promotion with only 3 international coffees. And what's interesting is the one with only 3 almost always outsells the one with 20, because too much choice causes paralysis. And we end up not buying because we simply can't decide. So there are issues regarding surpluses that needs to be investigated further. What's the consequences? This was the warning I gave as the consequence of a surplus. And remember, in this case, what is a surplus? A surplus means I've made a decision to carry 10. I can get daily replenishment, which most of the distribution supply chains can do today, especially in the developing nations. I can get daily deliveries from the closest RDC, regional distribution center, or DC, but I don't, because I don't order daily. So what is a surplus? A surplus says I'm carrying 10. The most that I've ever sold on one day is free. The 7 is a surplus. If I just capitalized or exploited the current capacity of the distribution center. But a surplus is also carrying an item that has a lower sales velocity than an alternative item that is available that for some reason I have made a decision not to carry. Now, book publishing to me was very interesting because they probably have more data than any other industry. For example, you go into a book retailer that typically might carry 20 to 40,000 different book titles, and you go and do a check. Do they carry the top 250 items on Amazon? You'd think that that might be an influencing factor, that from time to time the shop owner would say, let me have a look at that Amazon list and see if I'm carrying at least all top 250 or top 500. Don't be surprised when you find out that they're only carrying 50 or 60% of this. And knowing how skewed the distribution is of the bestsellers, it doesn't make sense at all. So the warning we gave is that surpluses are like bricks. You put bricks on the shelf. That's the equivalent of a surplus. 0 sales velocity. That is what we define as a surplus. So what has been the previous attempts to solve this problem? Because, of course, it's an important problem, and most stakeholders do realize it. But there are some assumptions that block them. But first of all, what was the previous attempts? More sophisticated forecasting systems. And this is really no joke. If you go in and you look at what systems they are really using very sophisticated systems. In fact, one of the book retail chains, one of the largest in the world that we went into when we were wanting to invite them to participate in this first set of pilots, said, we are using the most advanced software in the world. We go to conferences to present this. We've been part of the development of the algorithms. Okay. You're doing the best that you can, you're right. No way to improve, absolutely no way. So this is one problem, is that they have invested heavily in very, very smart computer systems. They've implemented central and regional distribution centers. The problem is, in many industries, there's a bit of a conflict now, because what used to happen was some of the retailers went to the manufacturers and said, I want you to create the DCs to be able to ship from the DC, because there's no way I'm accepting a 4-week lead time. At most, I want 2 or 3 days, which means that the manufacturer or distributor had to be within 2 or 3 days from the retailer at their expense. So they had to put up the infrastructure. until such time as the retailers started realizing the benefit of having these DCs. So they started putting up their own. And now you're kind of stuck, because now the retailer is telling you, I don't care about your DCs, I want you to deliver to my DC, I will do the distribution. But there has been huge investment in this, and as I mentioned, when you look at most of the supply chains within fast consumer goods, huge investment. The distribution networks in most cases already exist to do daily distribution. Even in some of the developing countries, apart from the real exceptions where there's real problems with infrastructure, like in India, for example. There's been huge investment in materials handling, traceability, barcoding, RFID. What was the result? Well, in most cases, the availability at the DC level is quite high, 97, 98%. And then you say, but has it really improved shortages and surpluses at the retailer? And this is where the research data shows very interesting statistics. That study of the GMA that's been repeated every 10 years, when it was first done in 1994, out of stocks, 8%. When it was done in 2004, out of stocks, about 8%. So despite all the improvements that have been made, of course, when you are increasing the range of products that you have access to, that you're trying to stock, you are increasing the defect opportunities, and therefore any benefits that you could have gotten from these is simply eradicated by the additional number of SKUs. So what makes it very difficult? Large number of SKUs, there's unpredictable and high variation in demand and supply, especially in this long tail that Umberto is describing. You know, you're selling typically one per month, one per 6 months, one per year. It could be that you sell 5 of those in 1 month, but it's completely randomness. And it's really difficult not to be fooled by randomness here, which is one of the problems with these very sophisticated forecasting algorithms. They are quite easily fooled by randomness. Lots of interdependencies between an SKU, which many of even the most sophisticated forecasting algorithms don't acknowledge. By buying this one, I'm not buying another one. Of course, the whole decision, therefore, of when to order, how much to order, and what to order becomes a very complicated decision. In fact, you can very nicely do a PhD on this. And the question that we had was, so this decision is so crucial because it governs the sales of the whole supply chain. It governs shortages and surpluses in the whole supply chain. Who makes this decision? That is so important. And to your surprise, or maybe not surprise, it isn't the one with the most information or the most skill. It frequently is a merchandiser, a buyer that has to deal with 10, 20, 30,000 items. So guess what? They have simplifying assumptions that they apply. How much did we order last time? Free, so let's order another free. The fact that we sold free on the first day, they simply don't have the bandwidth to acknowledge that. You go into a shop and you find out, why are you not stocking the best seller? Oh no, it's the buyer that makes the decision. So you go and we went with one of the largest retail chains in the world. We went through with them to do this kind of research. And you get to the buyer and you say, why did you decide not to order this one? Oh no, I don't like that author. Okay, that's an interesting criteria. Have you noticed the sales velocity everywhere else of this item? Yes, but I don't like the author. Very interesting. Or those books are quite small, so they are easily stolen, so we don't carry them. So you find out these things when you go into that the quality of these decisions are really impacted by who makes them, when they are made, and what their own criteria is. So we leave this decision to probably the people that are least qualified or with the least information. Now, of course, what happens, what causes shortages and surpluses, this is not news to anybody that's been in this industry. It says that I have the stock profile and I have demand. Here's my demand. here's my stock profile, that is a surplus, and that is a shortage. It's as simple as that. So why does it happen? Simply because of the way that stock levels are determined. They typically have a reorder point and a maximum, or min and a maximum, and the difference between that minimum and maximum, or the reorder point and the maximum, is typically a batch quantity that has been calculated based on frequently challengeable assumptions. In this case, what you see is we start off with 100, and we waste the full 100 all the way down to the reorder point before we decide to place an order. So if, once I've placed the order, the sales velocity is faster than what I expected, which could happen, or the time it takes to resupply is a little bit longer than I expected, I'm out of stock. Which kind of doesn't make sense, because you've bought the protection of the 100 and you waste it by delaying the decision on when you place orders and how much to order. So of course, what makes sense is just move away from ordering more less frequently towards ordering less more frequently. And many times it's purely about increasing the feedback loop, because we don't know when we start how much this thing will sell. But if I don't know how much it will sell, should I be looking monthly at it or daily? Not very complicated. So this has been known for a very, very long time. And there's a question about, if this has been known for a very long time, that what we should start doing is that we get every link in the supply chain to order less more frequently, and we should stop any link that is ordering more less frequently. Why, especially in the book publishing industry that is publishing the theory of this frequently, why aren't they doing it? What is really blocking them? So this is why this research topic to me personally was very interested, and Ellie also said, as an author, of course it's very frustrating as an author when you walk into a bookshop, and I'm sure you've done this, how many of the big bookshops are stocking Goldratt's books? And when you look at the sales velocity of the Gold, it's still selling at 20, 30,000 units per month. This is a bestseller. It's always in the top few hundred in Amazon. And how few bookshops have got this book? It's craziness. So this is why it's a really interesting topic to go into. So the industry background here, the book publishing industry specifically has been under huge pressure with declining sales and severe pressure to improve. What has happened is essentially the electronic books have caused a nightmare for book publishers. It was extremely low. Just 2 years ago, it was about 1% of this publishing company's sales. This year, it will be 10%. Worldwide. Nobody knows whether it's substitutional or additive. We don't know. If you download the book on your iPad or Kindle, does it mean that you don't buy the other book, the physical book, or do you still get both? The big problem for publishers is typically the pricing is about 50%. You might pay $20 for a physical copy, $9.99 for the electronic copy. So imagine a book publisher without the growth in the market, you could be potentially losing 50% of your sales. So real nightmare for them. Very high return rate. This specific book publisher had a return rate of just under 30%. The more common number is about 50%. So to put that in perspective, it means 50% of every book that's printed comes back for shredding. Terrible number. Many of the book publishers and retailers just assumes that the high returns is simply the price that we pay for not losing more sales. And in fact, there's a motto in the industry, stack them high, watch them fly. So, in 2008, we were approached by this company, as I mentioned, US-based, largest trade publisher in the world, 500 million books annually. They said, we've got a problem with returns, we've done the numbers, and it's worth about $50, $60 million per year if we can make a significant dent in the 28%. How do we know it's possible? Because there's quite a big difference between adult books and children's books. For some reason, Our team that is dealing with the logistics and sales in children's books are doing a much better job than the adult job. They are running at about 17, 18%, whereas the adult is sitting in the high 30s. So we know that it should be possible. So can you please help us to find out how to do this? There were no reliable data about the levels of surpluses and or shortages. All that we knew was how much the returns were, but we didn't know how much the actual surpluses were. And lastly, the question that they asked us is, we've studied a bit about theory of constraints. Is it possible that theory of constraints could help us solve this problem? So, the first thing that we did, after covering a little bit about our basis of where we would start to look for the problem, we said one way to ensure that a proposed change or solution doesn't have this high failure rate of about 70% is to apply very strict criteria when we are embarking on such a change. And we encourage them to use the same criteria that we use on all of our projects, which means we should have an expectation that we should get excellent results. And excellent results means it's outside the noise. So we wanted to find out, when you say surpluses is 28%, what is the noise within the 28%? If you show us your profitability, what's the noise within the profitability? We need to set a target that is significantly outside that. Else we wouldn't know whether the action or the change that we've made has actually resulted in improvement. Of course, it has to be based on win-win-win, so we need to involve on the front side, the printers, on the back side, the wholesalers and retailers, because as soon as it's a loss for one of these, performance will go down. We encourage them to use the same mechanism for calculating or determining the risk of an initiative. And what we've seen here is that most people use a very simplistic approach to judge the risk. They look at the probability of failure or success. Now, there's a big difference between playing the lottery and playing Russian roulette. Playing the lottery has an extremely high probability of failure, about 1 million out of 1 million. But what's the impact of failure is that you lose a few bucks. What's the impact of success is you could become a millionaire overnight. On the other side, Russian roulette has a very, very high probability of success, 5 out of 6. The problem is the impact of failure is not so good. And at the same time, the impact of success is also not so good. You just keep on living, you don't get a prize even. So we said you have to be careful here that maybe what we will be doing is asking you to do things that in your current way of judging might have a very high risk of failure, but a very small impact of failure and a very large impact of success. So be careful of how we make judgments on whether to try something or not. Of course, the warning from Ellie and Einstein has always been, make sure that the change you are proposing is simpler and not more complex. Because if it's complex, people won't understand it. There will be many ways to get it wrong. And you are moving in the opposite direction to what nature is calling for, as Einstein reminded us there. Fifth criteria is that whenever you are embarking on a change, make sure you communicate it in actionable information. Something that we've learned on our projects, the fact that somebody says, I agree or I understand, means nothing. It's lip service in most cases. The only way to check whether they agree or understand is to say, what are you going to do differently Monday morning? Can you please explain it to me? What are you going to start and stop doing? So we need to make sure that we communicate these changes in actionable information. And I want to share with you one of the results that we had. Very simple thing that we realized we didn't communicate properly. Of course, you have to have fast feedback. Reduce the time to detect and correct. And then the last one is be super paranoid. Don't just worry about what can go wrong, but what can go wrong if it really works. So, typically what they say is, our retailers will never agree to this mechanism. We can see the direction that it's going, but they will never agree. Why? Because they will refuse to hand over control of the ordering to anybody else. But what if they all agreed? And you've done what Umberto suggested. You've taken a kind of a micropilot, taken 100 titles of a of a population size of 40,000, and you've done it over 100 days, and we'll say 12 shops, and suddenly the results are good. What can then go wrong? So this is where we started, and we started looking at what is the impact of reducing returns from 30% to 15%, which is what their target was. And it was significant in terms of net profit, about a $25 million increase in net profit. 50%, which by itself was sufficient for them to do the test. When we highlighted also the impact on lost sales of both surpluses and shortages, of course this number became quite small in comparison. But I said to you, I wanted to share with you just to what extent not quantifying the consequences of a problem can change the strategy of a business. This company has US sales of about $1.5 billion US dollars. They were running at about profit margin of about 150 million. A new CEO was appointed, and his ambitious target was to double net profit from 150 to 300. The mechanism to do it was to double sales on the assumption that the margins are fixed, right? And this passed through the whole company. Of course, until you start doing the calculation and you realize that just by increasing my average selling price by 10% on 1.5 billion, that's 150 million. That by itself could double net profit. Or if I had to increase volume, if I could do it with the same level of operating expenses, only a 20% increase in sales would be required. 300 million minus the 150 variable cost would be required to double net profit. Now you think of a sales team, one sales team trying to go out there and find ways of doubling sales versus increasing sales by 20% or increasing the average selling price by 10%. You can see the impact it could have on a company's focus and direction. Or opposite, the lack of focus and direction. So, is it possible to reduce the returns was our first research question. Is high returns really the only cost of surpluses? What's the real level of unavailability? Is it possible to do much better than before? And if so, what changes will be needed in the various links to get the benefit? So we started with saying, this is currently the current profitability of both the book publisher and their customers, the wholesalers and retailers. What makes up that gap? Lost sales of stocked items, lost sales of non-stocked items, so a retailer decided not to stock it because of problems with space and cash, the cost of avoidable returns, avoidable discounts, and cases where the price that they are charging is lower than the perception of value, meaning that consumers would have tolerated a higher price. What does availability relate to? Those first three is essentially the result of shortages and surpluses. So the unavailability gap is causing the unprofitability gap. How do we quantify shortages and surpluses on profitability? Well, I've already said that we use the 5 focusing steps as a framework. Identify the system constraint for the whole system is until the consumer has bought, nobody has really sold. So it's the number of customers willing to buy or pay more. Deciding how to exploit it, you need the right product in the right place at the right time. What conditions block better exploitation, shortages, and unavailability of products that could have sold. And then subordinate, change anything that is in conflict with this decision of how to better exploit. Reducing shortages and surpluses. How will we find these, and will there be a win-win? So we started initially with just a conference call where I took them through the background. We then had a 2-day on-site visit where we went through the theory, agreed on the next steps, and then one of the next steps was to build a simulation for them that replicated their complexity and uncertainty to show them that the generic solution could have a huge impact and would be a huge win-win for everybody. We then scheduled 3 days in Amsterdam with Dr. Eli Goldratt to work with the executive team to build a strategy and tactic tree for the whole company. And then decided that the first step of that strategy and tactic tree was to initiate a test. So as I mentioned before, 100 titles per book shop, 100 days, 12 test shops, and 12 control shops. We then analyzed the results and made a decision about what to do next. And the idea was to find a simple and robust solution for it. So what makes quantifying the extent and consequences so difficult is despite excellent point-of-sale data available, you don't have visibility of actual shortages and surpluses in this industry. As I mentioned, they can get the actual sales and on-hand inventory data all the time. But interestingly enough, they didn't analyze it properly. So when you really look at the combination of on-hand inventory and point-of-sales data, it provides very interesting information, which I'll show you just now how we've utilized that. Of course, retailers can buy from the publisher to get the best price, but if the publisher has run out, frequently because they are pushing all the books into the trade, then they simply buy from the wholesaler. So you're not sure exactly whether the fact that the publisher is out of stock really caused the retailer to be out of stock because they have an alternative. So the first thing we did was we said, take the data that you have, actual sales and on-hand data per day for a specific bookshop, and just apply conditional formatting on it. You have that picture, which looks quite normal, and then you have that picture, which highlights to you when did you run out of stock. And in the cases where there are, in this case, this was from actual data from a retailer that said we are already replenishing every day. And I said, very interesting. You have one, you sell one, and then how can it be that for over a week, in fact, more than 9 days, 10 days, you don't get a replenishment? And yes, by the way, you gave me the data, which is what I asked for, to check there was stock in the DC. Oh. And then you sort of open up the potential that maybe, even though they might have the right rules, these rules are not being complied to, because everybody's second-guessing the others. So we started looking at this actual data to show where there are opportunities, where there were out-of-stock situations and there were actual sales velocity. And also realized that actually there's quite a practical way of converting out-of-stocks into lost sales. So if you take a supermarket that has relatively high sales velocity items, and you'll say take small units of soft drinks. If you know on average we sell about 5 per hour of this specific soft drink, you look at the point of sale data, an hour has gone by without any sale. Could be randomness. 2 hours have gone by without any sale. Unlikely to be randomness. 3 hours have gone by without any sale. I'm losing sales at an average rate of about 5 per hour. Using that simple analysis, I get an 80% correlation to real, actual lost sales of interviewing customers and said, would you have bought if you could find the product or if it was available? Very simple mechanism. So take the actual point of sale data, look for gaps, multiply it after a period of being conservative so we're not fooled by randomness, and you get a pretty good indication about what the actual lost sales are from the retailer perspective. So there's a benefit of flagging this. We then had also looking at stock out lost sales and surpluses lost sales. So with a simulator using actual data, we could calculate the impact of lost sales due to shortages of about 8% in this case and about 7% due to surpluses. And for surpluses, of course, what we did, we said if we were carrying 5, but we could get daily replenishment or replenishment 3 times a week, what is the most that we've ever sold in that period? And therefore, how much excess inventory are we carrying? And then, what could we have put in that place that we are not stocking that has a higher sales velocity than 0? And this is the good news. Anything with a higher sales velocity than 0 will increase sales. So our expectation when we started was around about 5 to 15, 20% increase. We then started looking at the data and found some very interesting and sometimes even disturbing things, This is from a very big retail chain that is carrying this publisher's books. Over the period of 3.5 years, 180 weeks, they carried 22,500 different titles. First thing is, 10% of the titles generated 65% of the sales, so a very long tail. But even more disturbingly, there were almost 5,000 titles that in the whole 3.5 year period, in all these bookshops, didn't sell 1 unit. And on average, they were sitting there for 29 weeks. So very interesting to say, at what point do I replace this item? Now, of course, it's very difficult if I know it's part of the tail, unless I have relative sales velocity. And I could say, this item has now gone past 20 weeks without selling. There's another item that is available in a DC that is selling at double that sales velocity, which I'm not carrying. So this is part of the answer of how do you decide, how do you deal with those things. You need relative sales velocity of other items that you are not carrying to make that decision. So we knew that there was quite a large opportunity to replace surpluses with one condition, that the shop only carried a small percentage of the total number that's available. As long as that condition is true, there's a really big opportunity for surplus replacement. And in some cases, even bigger than shortage reduction in terms of its impact on lost sales. So what makes it so difficult? There's, of course, uncertainty in demand. There's weak incentives for the retailers and distributors to improve returns. As I mentioned, whatever you don't sell, you can return at any point in time, and you only have to return the cover. There are duplication and buffers. There's printing economics that causes large batches. And what's also interesting is how some of these old rules are stuck. You go and you find what's the minimum print quantity, and they say 1,500. Now, 1,500 is bordering on the bestseller, which was kind of a surprise to me as not being an author. But a bestseller is sort of 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 copies sold ever. This is a really good book. So you now printing 1,500 when you have really no idea how much will sell, whether it will be 10 or 0 or maybe 2 million. So you're forced to print 1,500. Why? Because there's economies, problems in the printers. We go to the printers only to find that a surprising number is already digital, that there is in fact no real setup changes anymore. So they could print 100 if they want. Supply chain constraints like warehouse proximity. Of course, the goal is to print and distribute closer to what sells to the end consumer. This is the idea. The ultimate being printing on demand. And some of the retailers that we worked with have already indicated that in future, a big chunk of the tail could be dealt with by simply printing on demand units inside the shop. You go into, you open up the database, you do a search, you find the book that you're looking for, and you say, please print it, and they invite you to sit down, have a cappuccino, and by the end of the 30 minutes, you're walking away with a physical book. They will have to move in that direction to counter these e-books. Because remember, making it easy to buy and pay is the key of getting additional sales here. So what we suggested to them for the pilots is to simply put the 3 rules of TOC replenishment in. The planning rule, be paranoid but not hysterical, carry a target level based on the maximum expected demand within the reliable replenishment time. But acknowledging that the reliable replenishment time is made up of the order lead time and the supply lead time. And by just shrinking the order lead time to order daily, you can dramatically reduce the stock. And then as a second phase, you can challenge why the supply lead time is so long. Can't we shorten it by having a closer DC? And then lastly, to remove any unnatural peaks. The execution rule is simply once I've established the buffer, in this case around 300 units, within the replenishment time, I'm simply replenishing daily what was actually sold. The feedback rule is that if I notice that I'm going too much in the red, it's clear that I don't have enough of this item. I need to increase this target level, where when I notice that I'm no longer coming out of the green, within 2 or 3 replenishment periods, it's clear that I now have too much. And what we did was we used our simulation to create an indicative rule without any human interference will deal with various situations. This is for stable sales. This is a launch event most books that they are launched at operate according to this L curve. Big sales initially, but a very sharp drop after the advertising or the word of mouth is withdrawn. This is special events. Author appears on Oprah Winfrey, and out of nowhere, suddenly it becomes a bestseller overnight. This is how quickly the algorithm responds to it if you can get fast replenishment. And remember, as I mentioned, in this industry, in most cases, you can get daily replenishments. The fact that they don't, because they order such big quantities up front without really knowing what will sell, what will not, is quite strange. And then the last part, is how to deal with seasonality. And again, how to deal with the fast response is a key here. So essentially what we expect is if we're moving from a push to a pull, a push, most of the inventory is sitting at the back end. Yes, okay. So what's the lessons that we've learned in this test? The simple question of knowing how much sales have gone up by shouldn't be underestimated when you have such large variation. You really should be putting in the time to design the experiment so that you know. And we made many mistakes here in terms of selecting control groups that wasn't really control groups. So this is a warning. Something else is when you see that the change that you expected is different from what you actually got. So in some cases, the control shop outperforms the test shop. Now what? By diving into that, treating it as a mystery, as Ellie mentioned on day one, is you find out that actually the rule was never implemented properly. So they got stuck with replenishing on actual consumption. So they started with 2. 1 was sold, they replenish it. 2 was sold, they replenish it. They never got it up to the target level of maybe the 5. On the opposite side, the target level originally was 10. They never waited until it dropped before they started replenishing on actual consumption. So these things, checking for non-compliance is key to making sure that the result that you get matches your expectation. Very high level of acceptance, despite the fact that we were told that nobody will agree to this. In fact, some have taken long. They've been recently approached back by the largest retail chain and said, to their surprise, you take care of setting the model quantities, you replenish daily. We want some influence in terms of giving you our information about forecasts of known changes in demand and promotions, but essentially we are quite happy if you take it over because the logic that you are using makes sense and we can understand it. So whether you do it or we do it, there's no real difference. Major leverage in pricing, as I mentioned, replenishing daily on actual consumption. Initial tests were convincing in that there was a significant change, but there was quite large variation. Some there was no increase, others 10% increase. The average was about 3%. We fixed those mistakes, and in the second round of tests, we had far more convincing results. Average increase in sales 5 to 15% with about 5 to 15% lower inventories. Much closer to what our expectation and our simulation modeling was. We know that implementing dynamic buffer management, which is now being rolled out with the biggest online bookseller, as well as with 2 of the large retail chains, is going to improve this even more. The whole realization that bricks is what kills it for everybody, and that there's a big opportunity in surplus replacement. And that lastly, don't get confused by the large disproportionate impact of sales. As Umberto mentioned before, the long tail could hide many opportunities. And in fact, just a discussion about what to do with the 1s and the 2s, because that's where most of the space is occupied, becomes a very important decision. So what next? We've developed a S&T for the company. We started with high availability. We're looking at how to capitalize on the digital opportunity, how to capitalize on word of mouth, to initiate word of mouth first before you make a decision what will happen with the book in terms of how much will be printed. To resurrect dead horses. These guys have got about 1 million titles that are out of print. Most of them you will never know that they exist. And you start doing some numbers and say, these out of print things, if we can just get 100 sales globally from each of these units, by making them available. Somebody does a search and I can find that it's there and that we are quite comfortable to print it on demand for a premium of $30, $40, it could double the sales of this company. And of course, capitalizing on sales per shelf. So we started off with an in-house test. We ran a parallel test with a book chain, and the data is now sufficiently convincing that we are starting to roll. So in terms of future research opportunities, to share what Umberto shared, how best to deal with ones, because the current dynamic buffer management algorithm doesn't make sense there. We've already figured out, and we'll be glad to share all the research. How to best deal with surplus space if there are no better alternatives. This becomes a big issue. You don't want to create space that will be occupied by your competitor. So maybe the issue is, rather than keep your books like this with side-facing, to do it front-facing and capitalize on the space in that way. And then lastly, to what level the display quantity impact consumer response. This is our next topic, and hopefully I'll be able to present something about it next year, because you have the two extremes. You walk in, you see a lot of product, you buy because you think it's popular. The other one, which is a Zara type of strategy in Europe, you walk in, you find that there's only one. Oh boy, I better buy it before somebody else buys it. Not realizing that as you walk out, they just put another one there. Very clever. So thank you very much, and hope to share some more next year.